In 1988, 1,400 workers at ERF's Sandbach works were building 20 heavy lorries a day, each one hand-assembled to a haulier's specification, powered by Cummins or Gardner engines, the last independent trucks still made in Britain. Then the books began to lie. A sale to a Canadian company that didn't need it. A German acquisition built on accounts that had been falsified for 4 years. A £250 million fraud settlement, the largest in modern British corporate history. The Middlewich factory is a Wincanton distribution warehouse now. The lorries drive past the place where they were built. This is the story of Edwin Richard Foden, a 63-year-old engineer, fired by his own stepmother, who started a truck company in a Sandbach greenhouse with a chassis numbered to match his age, and how one financial controller in one Cheshire office brought down what 7 decades of hand-built lorries had created. Not through foreign competition, not through one boardroom blunder, through a fraud so patient and so thorough that by the time a 25-year-old accountant uncovered it, the damage was £100 million, and the badge was already dead. Chapter 1. The Board Minute Book. The story doesn't begin in a greenhouse. It begins in a boardroom at Foden's Elworth Works in Sandbach in 1932. Edwin Richard Foden, known as ER, born 28 March 1870, the elder surviving son of steam wagon pioneer Edwin Foden Sr., had spent his entire working life at the company his father built. He'd been works director for decades. He was 62 years old, a widower remarried, and the most experienced engineer in Cheshire's heavy vehicle trade. And in that boardroom, in late 1932, his own stepmother fired him. Annie Cowap Foden had inherited the company's controlling shareholding when ER's father died in 1911. For 20 years, she'd held the balance of power, not because she understood boilers or gearboxes or the commercial vehicle market, but because she held the shares. The family story, repeated for decades and codified in Peter Foden's 1995 book 60 Years On, cast ER as a diesel visionary forced out by a backward steam loyalist board. The inventor ahead of his time, the genius punished for seeing the future. It's a good story. It isn't quite true. The historian Alan Littlemore, working from the original Foden board minutes, dismantled the myth. ER was actually the steam loyalist. Into the early 1930s, he was still designing higher pressure boilers and superheaters, still convinced that steam had a commercial future on Britain's roads. It was his older brother William, Billy Foden, who'd emigrated to Australia in 1924 to escape Annie's interference, who converted ER to diesel by post. Billy had seen the Gardner engine at work in Melbourne and written home about it. The board, recognising the trend and the rising cost of steam boiler insurance, ordered ER in 1931 to design a truck around the new Gardner 4L2 diesel engine. He did so, by most accounts, reluctantly. The diesel versus steam quarrel was the technical pretext. The real fight was about control. Who owned the shares? Who sat in the chairman's seat? Whose name meant what inside those gates? Annie wasn't ER's mother. She was his father's second wife, a woman who'd inherited power over a company she hadn't built, making decisions about engineering she didn't understand, surrounded by a board that owed its position to her shareholding rather than to competence. ER, for all his decades on the works floor, held no controlling stake. The man who knew every rivet in the place was outranked by the woman who held the certificates. She won. ER was out. His son Dennis, then about 33, stayed inside Foden Limited. He couldn't afford to resign. He had a family and no alternative employer in a Cheshire market town in the depths of the Depression. So he watched his father leave and kept his head down and waited. What happened next to Foden Limited under Annie's leadership tells you everything about what ER's departure cost. The order book collapsed. By 1935, the company was building just 3 vehicles a year. 3. A works that had once defined British steam haulage was producing less than 1 lorry a month. The skilled men were idle. The supply chain was withering, and the market was moving, as markets do, toward the diesel technology that ER's brother Billy had seen working on the other side of the world. ER retreated to Blackpool to recuperate. He was 62 in an era when 62 was old. He could have gardened. He could have read the papers and waited for Annie's board to either recover or fail. Starting a new truck company in 1933, with no factory, no capital, no workforce, and a competitor run by your own stepmother 2 miles up the road would have struck most men as reckless, even in a good economy. In the depth of the Depression, it was closer to madness. Every established truck maker in Britain was struggling. Orders across the entire commercial vehicle trade were collapsing. The country was building fewer heavy vehicles than at any point since the war. But ER had something Annie didn't: the trust of the men who'd worked beside him for 40 years. The engineers, the fitters, the draftsmen who knew his methods and his standards. They couldn't give him capital, but they could give him the only thing more valuable. They could show up. He came back. Chapter 2. 4 Men in a Greenhouse. Just after Easter 1933, 4 men met in the greenhouse of Hillary House, the Elworth home of ER's eldest daughter, and decided to start a truck company. They were Edwin Richard Foden, 63, figurehead and principal designer. His son Dennis, who'd finally left Foden Limited to run operations. George Faulkner, a retired Foden manager and Dennis's relation by marriage, who became works manager. And Ernest Sherratt, an ex-Foden engineer who became chief designer. 4 men in a greenhouse, no factory, no capital to speak of, no order book, and a competitor up the road, controlled by ER's own stepmother, that would not welcome the rivalry. The name they chose, ERF, stood for nothing more than the founder's initials, Edwin Richard Foden. He couldn't use the family surname. That belonged to the company that had fired him. So the initials would have to carry the weight. In time, they'd become as recognisable on a lorry grille as any badge in British haulage. What they had was a network, and a town full of men who knew how to build trucks. A neighbouring Sandbach coach builder, John Henry Jennings and Son, lent them factory space and built the first cab. By June 1933, a 10-strong production team was at work, most of them former Foden men who'd followed ER because they trusted his engineering more than they trusted Annie's board. And in that first vehicle, designation CI4, for compression ignition, 4-cylinder, 4-wheel, ER made the choice that would define ERF for the next 7 decades. He didn't try to build everything in-house. He didn't attempt to replicate the vertically integrated model that Foden and Leyland used, where the chassis, the engine, the gearbox, the axles and the cab were all designed and manufactured under one roof. Instead, ER bought in best-of-breed proprietary components, Gardner engines, David Brown gearboxes, Kirkstall axles, and assembled them on a hand-built ERF chassis with a Jennings cab. He persuaded suppliers to provide parts on sale or return terms, an extraordinary expression of trust in a man who'd been sacked from his own family firm 6 months earlier. The kit truck philosophy, as it became known, made ERFs lighter than rivals and configurable to a customer's exact need. A haulier in Norfolk pulling grain wanted a different specification from a tanker operator in the Midlands, or a tipper fleet in the Welsh valleys, and ERF could give each of them precisely what they asked for without retooling an entire production line. A long-haul operator running the A1 corridor at night needed a different axle ratio and a bigger fuel tank than a construction firm running 8-wheelers to building sites across Manchester. ERF built for both. The customer told you what he wanted, and you built it. That was the business model. Not mass production, but mass customization, decades before the management textbooks invented the term. It also made the company unusually capital efficient. You didn't need to build an engine factory or a foundry when Gardner and Kirkstall already had ones that worked. You needed skill, a chassis jig, and the knowledge to put the right components together for the right job. The overheads were low, the quality was high, and the product was, by the testimony of the men who drove them, the most durable heavy lorry on British roads. That first truck debuted at the Olympia Commercial Motor Show in late 1933. Its chassis number was 63, chosen to match Edwin's age. It survives today, preserved at the British Commercial Vehicle Museum in Leyland. A small brass plate, a hand-assembled chassis, a Gardner engine bolted to a frame that 4 men had designed in a greenhouse, the founding document of Britain's last independent truck maker. The judges at Olympia were impressed, the trade press noticed, and the hauliers, the men who actually had to buy and run and maintain the trucks that moved Britain's goods, looked at the specification, looked at the price, looked at the weight, and started placing orders. The timing was fortunate. The Road and Rail Traffic Act 1933, passed the same year ERF was founded, imposed new licensing requirements on hauliers and effectively drove heavy steam wagons off Britain's roads. The future ER had been reluctant to embrace was now the only future available. Within months of his greenhouse meeting, the diesel bet was vindicated. Orders came. First, in ones and twos. Local hauliers who trusted the Foden name, even if not the Foden company. Then, in larger batches, as the trucks proved themselves. By 1938, ERF was building 480 vehicles a year from the Sunworks in Sandbach, and the personal split with Foden up the road had softened enough that both companies were on speaking terms. The war years accelerated everything. ERF built military vehicles for the War Office, not tanks or armoured cars, but the unglamorous, essential heavy lorries that moved ammunition, and supplies from the docks to the railheads, and from the railheads to the front. The same proprietary component philosophy that made civilian ERFs configurable made military ones repairable in the field. A damaged Gardner engine could be swapped from a parts pool, not requisitioned from one factory in Cheshire. A broken David Brown gearbox could be replaced with another from any workshop that stocked the same unit. The war taught the British Logistics Corps what peacetime hauliers already knew. An ERF was built to be maintained by the people who used it, not just the people who made it. When the peace came, the military contracts dried up, but the reputation didn't. Hauliers who'd driven ERFs in uniform came back as civilians and ordered them for their own fleets. By the early 50s, the Sunworks had expanded twice. The workforce was growing, the order book was deepening, and Sandbach, a Cheshire market town of fewer than 5,000 souls, sitting on the West Coast main line with the Trent and Mersey Canal at neighbouring Middlewich and the deep pool of skilled engineers from Crewe Railway Works within commuting distance, had become the improbable world capital of British heavy truck building. 2 factories, 1 family, 1 small corner of the Cheshire Plain turning out more heavy lorries per square mile than anywhere else in the country. Edwin Richard Foden died on 23rd December 1950, aged 80. He's buried at St. Peter's Church in Elworth. A short walk from the works his stepmother forced him to leave. He never saw the truck industry his work helped create reach its peak, but the company he'd started in a greenhouse with 4 men and a chassis, numbered 63, was, by the year of his death, one of the most respected names in British road haulage, and his son Dennis was about to hand it to the man who would make it an institution. Chapter 3. Clearview, Sabrina, and the men who built them. Dennis Foden took over as managing director in 1950, but died unexpectedly in 1960, and ERF passed to his nephew Edwin Peter Foden, known to the factory floor as Piggy, who would chair the company for 36 years. Peter Foden was not a figurehead. He walked the production line every morning, said good morning to nearly every employee, and visited customers in his Bentley, registration ERF1. His catchphrase, repeated by everyone who worked under him, "If my customer pays 10 bob for my truck, but I give him 20 bob's worth of customer service, I'll always hold my head high with the big boys." Under Peter Foden, the cabs became the signature. Gerald Broadbent, a young engineer at Jennings, designed the KV cab in 1954. Clear view, with curved split-screen glass that gave triplex headaches for years because nobody had bent windscreen glass at that angle for a commercial vehicle before. The curve was functional. It gave the driver better forward visibility than any flat-screen cab on the market, which on a heavy lorry, manoeuvring in a dockyard or reversing into a loading bay, was the difference between a clean turn and a crushed bollard. A forward control variant earned the nickname Sabrina after a busty television personality of the era. The cab's pronounced front profile was, the men on the shop floor decided, reminiscent, and the name stuck for decades. The LV, long view, followed in 1962 with clever vertical door handles designed so that haulage ropes wouldn't snag when drivers tied down loads. These weren't design flourishes dreamt up in a styling studio. They were solutions to problems that only people who understood haulage from the inside, who talked to drivers, who watched them work, who'd seen what happened when a ratchet strap caught on a horizontal handle, would think to solve. The Cummins option arrived in September 1961 on a KV-cabbed 8-wheeler, registration ONH567, built for Seabutt of Northampton. Rolls-Royce diesels had been offered since 1958. Each new engine option widened the configurability that was ERF's commercial advantage. The haulier chose the power unit the way you'd choose a suit from a tailor, not off the rack. Gardner for fuel economy and longevity, Cummins for power, Rolls-Royce for prestige. The chassis underneath was always ERF's own, hand-built in Sandbach by men who knew what a lorry needed to survive 200,000 miles of British roads. Imagine arriving for a shift at the Sun Works in the late 1960s. The smell of cutting oil and welding flux hit you before you reached the gates, the clang of chassis rails being jigged, the hiss of pneumatic tools and the low thrum of test engines running up on the dynamometer. ERF didn't stamp out identical trucks on a moving line the way Ford stamped out Cortinas at Dagenham. Each chassis was assembled by a small team who followed it from bare rails to finished vehicle, fitting the specific engine, gearbox, axle ratio, and cab trim that the customer had ordered. The process started with the chassis rails, heavy steel sections drilled and jigged to accept the engine mounts and suspension brackets for that particular specification. The crossmembers bolted in. Then the axles, the springs, the engine, lowered by crane if it was a big Cummins, wrestled into place if it was a Gardner 4. The gearbox, the prop shaft, the fuel tank, the air tanks, the wiring loom. Each stage required a different skill. The man who fitted the engine wasn't the man who wired the dashboard, and both of them knew their work would be tested on the dynamometer before the truck left the gate. The men knew whose truck they were building. They knew it was going to Eric Vick's fleet in Runcorn, or Beresford's in Stoke, or Jack Richards and Son in Norfolk. That personal connection between builder and buyer was ERF's culture, and it produced a loyalty among workers and customers alike that the continental manufacturers, for all their engineering excellence, couldn't replicate. A finished ERF rolling out of the gate at Sandbach carried the work of dozens of pairs of hands, not one of them anonymous. A man who'd served his time at ERF carried a particular pride. He hadn't built consumer goods that broke in a year. He'd built lorries that would run 500,000 miles, and he could name the fleets they'd gone to. The B-Series, launched at Earl's Court in September 1974, was the first ERF with a tilt cab, and Commercial Motor later called it the backbone of Britain's transport fleets. Exports reached South Africa, Australia, the Middle East, and Commonwealth markets. The trucks went everywhere. The name still meant something, and in the process, they built a reputation for durability that no brochure could have manufactured. An ERF in the Australian outback, running cattle between stations in temperatures that would warp a lesser cab, was the best advertisement the Sandbach works ever produced. Hauliers talked to hauliers. The word travelled. By the late 1970s, ERF was building around 4,000 chassis a year with a Sandbach workforce of 1,400. The works had its own rhythm. The morning shift arriving through the gates, the canteen running tea from 6 o'clock, the steady percussion of pneumatic guns and rivet hammers that you could hear from the road outside. In a town where both truck factories drew from the same streets, the same schools, the same families, the identity wasn't just employment. It was craft. It was the knowledge that the lorries on the motorway, the ones carrying the food and the fuel and the building materials that kept the country running, had been built by your neighbours, tested on your roads and sent out into the world with your name on the work order. Those floors would one day fall silent. Chapter 4. 2 factories, 1 town. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what Sandbach was. Not just a place where trucks were assembled, but a town organised around 2 truck factories the way a pit village was organised around its colliery. Sandbach sits on the Cheshire plain, flat country threaded with canals and railways, Saxon crosses in the cobbled square, a history that went back centuries before anyone bolted an engine to a chassis. But by the mid-20th century, the town's identity had been reshaped entirely by the 2 works. Foden's Elworth Works and ERF's Sun Works sat about 2 miles apart, run by branches of the same family, sharing the same pool of Cheshire engineers, men who'd trained at Crewe Railway Works or apprenticed at one firm and moved to the other, carrying skills across a town small enough that everybody knew everybody. The supply chain was shared. Gardner engines from Patricroft, Jennings cabs from next door, Kirkstall axles from Leeds. A man who'd spent 20 years fitting Gardner's 6 LXBs at Foden could walk down the road and do the same job at ERF, and some did, particularly after Foden hit trouble in the early 80s. Families split between the 2 factories. A father at Foden, a son at ERF, brothers on opposite sides of the same supply chain. The rivalry was real, but the community was shared. The same pubs, the same social clubs, the same streets. The famous fleets of the Golden Age read like a roll call of British road haulage. Eddie Stobart, before the name became a brand on curtain siders, visible from every motorway bridge in England, ran ERFs. Lowfield Distribution of Middlewich ran them. Britvic ran them. The 8 Lowfield drivers, Dave Vernon, Alan Biddle, Peter Pryor, Paul Anderson, Steve O'Brien, Trevor Boss, Barry Holden, Wally Walton, Lee Knight, were photographed touring the Sandbach Works in August 1989, each of them grinning beside the truck that would carry their livelihood for the next 500,000 miles. These weren't anonymous customers placing orders through a dealer network. They drove to Sandbach to watch their own trucks being built, shook hands with the fitters who installed their engines, and came back for servicing with stories about which roads they'd been running and how the truck had handled the load. Dave Roberts worked at the Middlewich Service Centre from 1974 to 2000, 26 years servicing ERFs that came back the way a patient returns to a trusted doctor. His Middlewich Diary blog preserves much of the oral history that would otherwise have vanished when the works closed. Names, stories, the texture of a working life spent keeping British lorries on the road. Colin Proudlove, Dave Johnson, Steve Farrington, Andy Newall, David Briscoe. These were the men who kept the service operation running, who knew every bolt pattern and every wiring quirk on every ERF variant going back to the B-series. They could diagnose a Cummins misfire by ear. They could tell you which model year had the wiring loom routed too close to the exhaust manifold. 20 years of accumulated knowledge, stored in the hands and the memory of men whose names never appeared in an annual report. When a haulier brought an ERF in for a service, he wasn't handing it to a stranger. He was handing it to someone who knew the truck's history, which engine was fitted when the clutch was last changed, what the fuel consumption should be at 60,000 miles. That knowledge was ERF's after-sales advantage, and it couldn't be replicated by a dealer network working from a computer screen. The E-Series arrived in April 1986, backed by a £21 million investment, the biggest single capital commitment in ERF's history. Its cab was steel-framed but clad in SMC, sheet moulding compound, ERF's signature lightweight composite that made the trucks lighter, more fuel-efficient and more resistant to the corrosion that ate through conventional steel cabs in a British climate of salt spray and endless rain. Continental rivals used all-steel cabs that weighed more and rusted faster. ERF's composite panels were bonded, not welded, a different kind of craftsmanship applied by men who'd been trained in a material that no other British truckmaker used. The factory was building 20 E-Series a day at Sandbach, with another 3 to 5 rolling off a new line at Middlewich. 20 trucks a day, each one different, each one assembled to a customer's specification. That was the scale ERF had reached, and it was the scale at which Peter Foden believed the company could survive as an independent against the continental giants. The 21 million was a bet that if you built the best truck for the British market would buy enough of them to keep you alive. Then came the EC series, launched in May 1993 to coincide with ERF's Diamond Jubilee under the slogan "Driving the Future." Developed for £14 million, panelled to be 80% recyclable, powered by a choice of Cummins, Rolls-Royce, Caterpillar or Detroit Diesel, the EC became the best-selling product in the company's history. John Bryant's Fuel Duel marketing campaign proved it truck against truck, ERF against the Continentals, on real roads with real loads, and the numbers didn't lie. The EC used less fuel per ton-mile than a Volvo FH, less than a Scania 4 Series, less than a DAF 95. For hauliers operating on margins measured in pence per mile, that difference was the difference between profit and loss. The flagship Olympic trim, added in 1994 with high roof, air conditioning, microwave, velour seats and tinted glass, became a status symbol for owner-drivers. These were the men who lived in their cabs for 5 or 6 days a week, who slept in the bunk behind the seats, who ate their meals off the dashboard and showered at truck stops between loads. The Olympic wasn't a luxury. It was a workplace designed by people who understood what long-haul driving actually felt like, designed in Sandbach by engineers who talked to the drivers who bought the trucks, not in a design studio in Stuttgart or Gothenburg by people who'd never spent a night in a lay-by on the A1. The microwave wasn't a gimmick. It was a hot meal at 2 a.m. when the only alternative was a cold sandwich or a service station that charged £4 for a plate of chips. The tinted glass wasn't vanity. It was sleep, in daylight, in a cab that heated up like a greenhouse when you parked facing south. The October 1988 edition of the ES6, with its Steyr Austrian steel cab, had been a hedge, a nod to continental manufacturing practice, but the composite cab remained the heart of the range and the reason hauliers kept coming back. An ERF composite cab, maintained properly, would outlast a steel cab by years. The men who bonded those panels knew it, and the drivers who sat in them knew it. By 1993, Commercial Motor called ERF the only surviving independent British truck manufacturer, the last one standing in a field that had once held a dozen names. Chapter 5. The Diamond Jubilee and the Cliff Beyond. ERF's peak has a precise date. In 1988, the company registered 3,740 trucks in the UK, 11.6% of the over 16-ton market. Peter Foden told Commercial Motor he was aiming for 15. The workforce stood at 1,400. The Middlewich line was humming. The E-Series was winning fleet trials against Volvo and Scania and DAF. For a bright, brief moment, it looked as though one independent British truck maker might actually survive. The confidence was real. The order book was full. The EC Series was about to launch. Peter Foden was still walking the line every morning, still visiting customers in the Bentley, still the living thread connecting the greenhouse in 1933 to the works floor in 1988. The Sandbach Transport Festival, founded in 1992, would soon be drawing 10,000 spectators to watch preserved Fodens and ERFs parade through the town. A celebration of an industry that felt permanent, of a craft that the town believed would outlast any recession. Foden's brass band, 12-time national brass band champions, the town's other claim to fame, played while the lorries rolled past. The two factories and the brass band. That was Sandbach. But then the recession hit, and hit hard. UK domestic heavy truck sales fell from around 4,000 chassis to 1,083 in 1981, a 75% collapse in 3 years. The workforce was cut from 1,400 to just over 600 by the end of 1983, with the factory on a 2-day week. Men who'd expected to retire from ERF were standing in the job centre in Crewe. Anne Winterton, the Conservative MP for Congleton, spoke in Hansard of the crisis. Men in their 50s believe that they will never work again. And she was right. The skills that had taken decades to accumulate didn't transfer to the service sector jobs that were replacing manufacturing across Cheshire. Foden, the full-time rival up the road, fared even worse. It entered receivership in July 1980 and was bought by American giant PACCAR for $39 million. The first wave of British truck deaths had already begun. A EC had gone in 1979. Albion in 1980, Guy in 1982. One by one, the names that had built the roads of the British Empire were disappearing. ERF survived. It survived because Peter Foden kept the overheads lean, because the kit truck philosophy meant the company wasn't carrying the fixed costs of an engine factory, and because the hauliers who'd built their businesses on ERF reliability came back when the orders returned. The recovery, when it came, was swift. By the mid-80s, the workforce was rebuilding. The Sunworks was expanding, and Peter Foden was planning the E-Series investment that would define ERF's final golden age. But the warning signs were there for anyone who cared to read them. Continental brands, Volvo, Scania, DAF, Mercedes, MAN, Iveco, already controlled more than half the British heavy truck market. Leyland DAF had collapsed into receivership on February 2nd, 1993, with £1 billion of debt. Bedford had gone in 1986. Seddon Atkinson was Spanish-owned. Foden was American. ERF's UK market share, even at its 1988 peak, sat below 12%, and the cost of complying with successive Euro emissions standards, Euro 1 in 1992, Euro 2 in 1995, Euro 3 in 2000, was enormous. The arithmetic was merciless. Volvo built 150,000 trucks a year. Scania built 80,000. MAN built 60,000. ERF, at its absolute peak, built fewer than 4,000. The development cost of a new engine meeting, the next emissions standard, was roughly the same, whether you spread it across 150,000 units or 4,000. The continental manufacturers paid pennies per truck in R&D amortization. ERF paid pounds. Every time Brussels tightened the emissions limit, The gap between what it cost to be a European truck maker and what it cost to be a British independent widened by another few million. Fuel efficiency didn't pay for emissions R&D. Customer loyalty didn't fund a clean sheet cab design. The sums were moving against every independent manufacturer in Europe, and ERF was the smallest independent left. ERF's EC was brilliant. ERF's balance sheet was thin, and the man who ran the balance sheet was about to start lying. Chapter 6. The Canadians and the Continental Tide. The deal that killed ERF arrived in the summer of 1996, though nobody knew it at the time, and the men who signed the papers believed they were saving the company, not condemning it. In June 1996, Western Star Trucks Holdings Limited, of Kelowna, British Columbia, acquired ERF Holdings, plc, for £27.4 million in cash, £2.75 per share. Western Star's owner was the Australian businessman Terry Peabody, whose family trusts held about 42% of the listed company. He'd bought Western Star out of American distress in 1991 and was looking for a European foothold. ERF's proprietary component philosophy and its Cummins purchasing volume made it a logical fit. Complementary niches, shared supply chain, the kind of deal that reads well in an investment bank's pitch book. The EC cab was even reused in Australia as the Western Star Commander 7564. For ERF, the acquisition meant access to capital that Peter Foden's lean operation had never generated internally. For Western Star, it meant a presence in Europe's fifth-largest truck market. On paper, it made sense. On 31 December 1996, Peter Foden retired as chairman and chief executive, becoming honorary life president. John Bryant, managing director since November 1991, became the public face of the company. The Foden family era at ERF, 63 years after a 63-year-old started it, was over. The man who'd walked the line every morning, who'd known every worker by name, who'd driven to customer premises in a Bentley with the registration ERF1, stepped back. Whatever came next would be shaped by people who hadn't grown up in Sandbach, who didn't know the supply chain by instinct, who measured a truck company by its balance sheet rather than by the pride of the men who built the trucks. Western Star's tenure looked, on paper, successful. Turnover reached around £200 million with sales of roughly 3,000 trucks in the year to June 1999. The company diversified into municipal vehicles, acquired the Bedford parts operation from Marshall SPV, partnered with Turkish manufacturer BMC, and broke ground on a £28 million new factory at Midpoint 18 in Middlewich to replace the aging Sunworks. Money was being spent. Plans were being drawn. The future appeared to be under construction in a very literal sense. Foundations poured, steel going up, a new factory rising on the Cheshire plain. Western Star even had ERF developing the EC cab for export markets, rebadging it as the Western Star Commander 7564 for the Australian market. The cross-pollination looked productive. The partnership looked real. But beneath the surface, two things were happening simultaneously, and both were corrosive. The structural pressures on ERF's independence hadn't gone away. They'd intensified. And in a finance office in Middlewich, the man who had been preparing ERF's accounts for 2 decades had started to manipulate them. Euro 2 emission standards had arrived in 1995. Euro 3 was coming in 2000. Each new emissions tier required engine development that cost tens of millions of pounds, money that Volvo could spread across 150,000 trucks a year, and ERF had to absorb across 3,000. The continental manufacturers were consolidating around them. Volvo had taken Renault trucks. MAN was growing. PACCAR, Foden's owner, had acquired DAF and Leyland. The UK heavy truck market was increasingly a fight between 6 or 7 European giants, and ERF was a bantamweight in a heavyweight ring. The EC was still winning fleet trials, still the most fuel-efficient truck on British roads, still the truck that owner-drivers wanted. But fuel efficiency doesn't pay for emissions R&D, and customer loyalty doesn't fund a clean-sheet cab design. And from about the middle of 1997, the accounts had begun to lie. The man doing the lying had been at ERF for 21 years. Nobody outside a small Sandbach finance office knew what he was doing. The board didn't know. Western Star didn't know. Bryant didn't know. Or if he suspected, the court would later find no evidence that he did. The accounts arrived at each board meeting looking the way accounts are supposed to look: revenue growing, assets healthy, the company solvent. The numbers told a story of a truck maker finding its feet under Canadian ownership, investing in new facilities, diversifying its product range. It was a convincing story. It was also, in material respects, untrue. The fraud didn't begin with a grand plan. It began, as most long-running frauds do, with a small adjustment. An asset inflated here, a revenue line brought forward there, and then another, each one a little larger than the last, each one a little harder to unwind, until the gap between the real numbers and the reported numbers had become a chasm that no corrective entry could bridge. Stephen Ellis had built a phantom company on top of the real one, and the phantom was the version that went to the auditors, the board, the market, and ultimately to man. Chapter 7. The Ledger and the Lie. His name was Stephen Ellis. He'd joined the company in August 1976, the year Britain went to the IMF and the manufacturing base was already beginning its long contraction. He wasn't a qualified accountant. He'd never passed the professional exams. He'd learned bookkeeping on the job at ERF, risen through the finance department by competence and longevity, become deputy financial controller, and then financial controller and company secretary. The man who prepared the monthly management accounts, the year-end statutory accounts, and the figures that every auditor, every buyer, and every board member relied upon to understand whether ERF was solvent. He'd been doing the job for 2 decades. He knew every line in the ledger. He knew what the auditors looked for and what they overlooked. He knew the rhythms of the accounts, when the stock figures were checked, when the revenue was reconciled, when the VAT returns were filed. And when he began to manipulate those numbers, he did so with the patience and precision of a man who understood the machinery he was breaking. The popular narrative has sometimes attached a different name to the fraud. Robin Dingle appears in some online retellings, but that name exists nowhere in the case record. The definitive account is the High Court judgment of Lord Justice Moore-Bick in Man Nutzfahrzeug AG versus Freightliner Limited, handed down in 2005 and upheld on appeal in 2007. The fraudster was Stephen Ellis. The court found on common ground between the parties that from about the middle of 1997, Ellis systematically manipulated both the monthly management accounts and the year-end statutory accounts, while simultaneously running false claims for VAT repayment against HM Customs and Excise. The mechanics were patient and methodical. He inflated asset values on the balance sheet, making the company look wealthier than it was. He treated unsold stock vehicles sitting in yards as factory orders that had been invoiced and dispatched. Trucks that hadn't been sold were booked as revenue, making the income statement look healthier than it was. He manipulated supplier ledgers, altering the record of what ERF owed to its parts providers. He engaged in what the trade press described as early invoicing and Spanish invoicing, routing revenue through channels designed to make it appear earlier or larger than it was, creating the illusion of sales activity that hadn't occurred. And alongside all of this, he was filing false claims for VAT repayment against HM Customs and Excise, systematically claiming back tax on transactions that had never taken place, extracting cash from the public purse through fraud. Each manipulation was small enough to avoid triggering an immediate alarm. Taken together, across 4 years, they built a phantom company on top of the real one. The phantom company was profitable, growing, solvent. The real company was struggling, loss-making, and burning through cash. Every board decision, every investment plan, every conversation about ERF's future was based on the phantom version. The people making those decisions didn't know the real version existed. The 1998 audited accounts overstated ERF's assets by approximately £20.5 million. The 1999 accounts overstated them by approximately £35 million. By the time the full picture emerged, ERF's true position was net liabilities of around £75 million, not the represented net assets of around £25 million. A balance sheet hole of approximately £100 million, built line by line, quarter by quarter, by one man in a Middlewich finance office. ERF's auditors throughout were Ernst & Young, UK. The engagement partner was Alison Cunningham, later Mrs. Cinderson. Ernst & Young would later admit in litigation that their statutory audits had been negligent. The checks that should have caught what Ellis was doing, the reconciliation between physical stock and booked stock, between real revenue and phantom revenue, between actual VAT obligations and the claims he was filing, either weren't performed with sufficient rigour or weren't performed at all. And then, on the 20th of September 1999, 6 months before Mann bought the company, something happened that should have changed everything. Mrs. Cinderson received a phone call. A retired bank executive named Frederick Poynton, whose daughter worked at ERF, told her that misleading information was being supplied to the auditors at the behest of senior management. This was a whistleblower tip-off, not a vague rumour, not an anonymous note slipped under a door. A named individual with professional banking experience, calling the audit engagement partner directly, telling her that the numbers she was signing off on were wrong. The machinery of corporate governance, the auditors, the board, the regulatory framework, existed precisely for this moment. A whistleblower came forward. The system was supposed to respond. It didn't. Ernst & Young's response was inadequate. The 1999 audit was signed off. The accounts went to the board. The accounts went to the market. The accounts went, in due course, to Mann Nutzfahrzeuge AG of Munich, whose executive board was about to spend £110 million acquiring a company whose books were fiction. The Poynton call would become one of the most contested moments in the subsequent litigation, a point at which the entire catastrophe could have been averted by a single firm doing its job. Frederick Poynton did what the governance framework asks people to do. He raised the alarm, and the alarm was ignored. Negotiations between Western Star and Mann had begun on June 4, 1999. Terry Peabody and John Bryant met Dr. Klaus Brohn of Mann's executive board. Through the summer, the discussions continued. Due diligence, factory visits, board presentations. A critical meeting took place at the Belfry Hotel on the 19th and 20th of August 1999. A golf resort in Warwickshire, conference rooms overlooking manicured fairways, at which Stephen Ellis was present in his capacity as financial controller, presenting the numbers that justified the price. Ellis sat across a table from Ann's executives and presented 4 years of falsified accounts as though they were the truth. The deal moved forward. On January 30th, 2000, Mann signed a share purchase agreement to buy ERF Holdings for approximately £65 million in cash, plus assumed debts of around £23 million, a total enterprise value of roughly £110 million. The European Commission approved the deal on March 1st. Completion followed on March 8th. 3 Mann executive board members, Brun, Dr. Volker Dietz, and Mr. Wagner, joined the ERF board. Bryant remained as managing director. Western Star paid Stephen Ellis a £15,000 gratuity for his help with due diligence. £15,000 for presenting false accounts to the buyers of a company whose real value was £100 million less than the asking price. And why was Western Star selling? Because Terry Peabody had a bigger deal in train. In parallel, Freightliner Trucks, a subsidiary of Daimler Chrysler, was acquiring Western Star itself in a transaction worth $670 million. With Mercedes-Benz trucks already inside Daimler Chrysler, Freightliner had no use for ERF's UK business. The chain of deals had a logic that satisfied every corporate balance sheet involved. Western Star got $65 million for a subsidiary it no longer needed. Mann got a foothold in Britain. Freightliner got Western Star's North American operation without a competing European subsidiary. Peabody got his exit. Every investment banker collected a fee. Every board approved. Every lawyer signed off. Except the numbers underneath were wrong. And the legal consequence was that Freightliner, a Daimler Chrysler subsidiary, inherited Western Star's liability for whatever Stephen Ellis had been doing in Sandbach since 1997. The chain of liability ran from a Middlewich desk to a Kelowna boardroom to a Stuttgart headquarters, crossing 2 oceans and 3 jurisdictions before the final check was written. Chapter 8. The Unraveling. The fraud was 16 months old under Mann ownership when it began to crack. After the acquisition, Mann brought in Deloitte and Touche and started converting ERF's books from UKG AAP to international accounting standards, standard procedure for a German parent company that needed its British subsidiaries' accounts to speak the same language as the rest of the group. But the conversion required Deloitte's accountants to go deeper into the numbers than a routine audit ever would. They weren't just checking that the accounts added up. They were translating them from one framework to another, and in that translation the seams showed. Entries didn't reconcile. Supplier balances didn't match. Stock records described vehicles that couldn't be found in the yards. Mr. Young, an MAN internal auditor, visited ERF in April 2001 and found the purchase ledger in disarray. The word is careful, bureaucratic. But disarray, in the context of a heavy truck manufacturer acquired for £110 million, carries the weight of everything that followed. On 1 June 2001, a 25-year-old qualified accountant named Stephanie Frobisher joined ERF's finance department. She was new. She was properly qualified, with the professional training that Stephen Ellis had never had. She had fresh eyes that 25 years of institutional familiarity had blinded everyone else to. And within 6 weeks, working through the ledgers that Ellis had manipulated for 4 years, she found the architecture. The discrepancies weren't subtle once you looked with qualified eyes. Stock that existed in the books, but not in the yards. Revenue booked for vehicles that hadn't been delivered. VAT claims filed against transactions that had never occurred. Each individual manipulation was small enough that an auditor performing standard checks might miss it. But together, they formed a pattern that was unmistakable to anyone trained to look for it. Ellis had relied on the fact that nobody at ERF had the qualification or the fresh perspective to see what he was doing. For 4 years, nobody had. On the 18th of July 2001, Frobisher wrote to Mann's head of audit, Mr. Weinman, warning that the discrepancies discovered so far were only the tip of the iceberg and asking for reinforcements. She was 25 years old, 6 weeks into a new job, writing to a German multinational to tell them that the company they'd just bought was built on sand. The courage that letter required is easy to underestimate. She was a junior accountant in a finance department controlled by a man who'd been there for a quarter of a century, telling her employers something they didn't want to hear about a purchase they couldn't undo. And she was right. 5 days later, on July 23, 2001, Stephen Ellis was suspended. Days after that, John Bryant and Klaus Wagner, the man-appointed chief financial officer, were also suspended, on the basis that they were responsible for the function in which the fraud had occurred. The court would later find no personal dishonesty by either man. Freightliner abandoned, on appeal, any contention that Ellis's knowledge could be attributed to senior officers as their own. The fraud was Ellis's alone. The failure to detect it belonged to others. The story broke in the Crew Chronicle on August 23, 2001. ERF bosses suspended. A man spokesman in Munich said the auditors would have to review everything back to 2000 and before. The initial estimate of irregularities in excess of £10 million expanded within weeks. By the time MAN's auditors had finished counting, the balance sheet deficiency stood at approximately £100 million. The entire purchase price, and then some, had been fiction. On the 11th of October 2001, MAN's chairman Håkan Samuelsson flew to Sandbach and announced that ERF was being reprieved, but with the Middlewich workforce cut from 770 to 400, 370 redundancies. Dave Roberts' service centre, Colin Proudlove's stores, the men who'd built the EC Olympic and serviced the fleets that kept Britain's goods moving. 370 of them told there was no longer a job for them in a town that had been building trucks since 1933. Men in their 40s and 50s, with 20 or 30 years of specialised truck building experience, chassis jigging, composite panel bonding, engine installation, the particular craft of assembling a heavy lorry to an individual customer's specification, made redundant into a local labour market that had no use for what they knew. The skills that had taken decades to accumulate didn't transfer to the distribution warehouses and call centres that were replacing manufacturing across Cheshire. Anne Winterton's words from 20 years earlier echoed, "Men in their 50s, believing they would never work again." The TGWU handled the redundancy consultations. No major parliamentary intervention was recorded, perhaps because the closure was framed as the restructuring of a foreign-owned company recovering from fraud, not the death of a British industry. 5 months later, in March 2002, Mann concluded that the Middlewich works was unviable, a further 200 redundancies. UK manufacturing ended in July 2002, with the last of the ECS and ECX models rolling off the line. The town that had built 4,000 trucks a year at its peak watched the last handful roll through the gates. John Smith, the Middlewich storeman, organised the closing social at Pockins Club, a works do for a works that no longer existed. The men drank and told stories and went home to houses paid for, with wages earned, building lorries that would outlast their employment by decades. Some retrained, some retired early, some found work in the logistics sector that was replacing manufacturing across the county, driving the trucks they'd once built, or loading them, or managing the warehouses where the goods were sorted. The irony was quiet but persistent. The industry that had killed their jobs still needed their labour, just in a different form and at a lower wage. From August 2002, every ERF badged truck was an MAN. Assembled in Munich and Steyr, shipped to the UK, fitted with a Cummins ISME engine as the only differentiator, sold under a name that now meant nothing more than a grill badge on someone else's vehicle. The hand-built Cheshire lorry, configured to a haulier's specification by men who knew what the job demanded, was replaced by a German truck with a British badge. The hauliers could see the difference. They'd known the old ERFs intimately. The composite cabs, the bespoke configurations, the particular feel of a truck that had been assembled by people who talked to drivers and built accordingly. The new ERF was a good truck. It was a man truck. But it wasn't what the badge used to mean. Registrations fell. Year on year, quarter on quarter, they fell. Man sued. Proceedings were issued in 2002 in the Commercial Court, case number 2002, folio 1041. The legal teams assembled were among the most expensive in the city. Dominic Kendrick, QC, for MAN, instructed by Slaughter and May, Geoffrey Voss, QC, who would later rise to become Sir Geoffrey Voss, Master of the Rolls, the second most senior civil judge in England and Wales. For Freightliner, instructed by Clifford Chance, Justin Fenwick, QC, for Ernst & Young. The fees alone must have run into tens of millions. The fraud that started in a Middlewich finance office had generated a litigation industry that dwarfed anything ERF ever produced on its assembly line. The trial was long and technically dense, but the core questions were simple. Who was responsible for Ellis's lies, and who should pay? The answers turned on vicarious liability, the scope of an auditor's duty, warranty claims under a share purchase agreement, the mechanisms by which a commercial court judge would determine how £250 million loss would be distributed among corporations in 3 countries. Lord Justice Morbick handed down judgment on October 28, 2005. Western Star, and therefore Freightliner as its successor, was vicariously liable in deceit for Ellis's fraudulent statements during the sale. Freightliner was also liable on tax-related warranties under the share purchase agreement. The third-party claims against Ernst & Young failed. The auditors owed only a general duty under the Caparo principle, not a special duty to a future acquirer. Ernst & Young had been negligent. They admitted it. But the law protected them. The auditors who'd failed to catch the fraud walked away. Daimler, who'd inherited Western Star's liabilities through Freightliner, did not. The Court of Appeal upheld Morbick in full on 12 September 2007. No further appeal was taken. In 2008, MAN and Freightliner settled. Per Eman's own disclosure, Freightliner would pay an indemnity of £250 million to Eman. Daimler, through Freightliner, wrote a £250 million cheque to a German rival to compensate for what a Cheshire financial controller had done to the books. And what happened to Stephen Ellis? The civil case proceeded on the common ground that he'd committed both false accounting and systematic VIT fraud. Yet, despite extensive searches of court records, Serious Fraud Office archives, HMRC, press notices, and contemporaneous regional press, no record of a criminal prosecution, conviction, or sentence has surfaced in any indexed source. For a fraud of this scale, the largest fraud on acquisition case in modern British corporate history, this absence is remarkable. It is the single most important unanswered question of the entire ERF story. Chapter 9. A country that doesn't build its own lorries. The end of the badge came on a precise date. In July 2007, with Cummins refusing to engineer a Euro 4 compliant version of the ISME engine and ERF registrations down 46%, year on year to just 81 units, MAN ERF UK's chief executive, Des Evans, announced that ERF production would cease. Due to the fact we no longer have a Cummins engine as a differentiator, he told logistics manager, that demand has shrunk to almost nothing. MAN ERF UK Ltd was renamed MAN Truck and Bus UK Ltd. 74 years after a greenhouse meeting in Sandbach, the name disappeared from the cab. Sandbach lost both its truck makers within 5 years. PACCAR, having bought Foden out of receivership in 1980, progressively absorbed the company as it acquired other European brands. After PACCAR took DAF in 1996 and Leyland Trucks in 1998, Foden became redundant. 3 truck brands in one corporation was too many. Sandbach Assembly closed in 1999 with production moved to Leyland in Lancashire. The 30-acre Elworth Works, where Edwin Foden Sr. had built steam wagons in the Victorian era and where ER had spent his entire career before Annie fired him, fell silent. In June 2005, PACCAR announced the Foden brand would be retired entirely. The final Foden, an 8x4 rigid tipper, was built at Leyland in August 2006, ending 150 years of Foden manufacturing since Edwin Foden Sr.'s 1856 apprenticeship. The brand vanished a year before ERF's. The town that had built 2 competing British truck marques for 7 decades lost both within 60 months. ERF was the last of a procession. A EC had gone in 1979. Absorbed into Leyland, the name retired. Albion in 1980. Guy in 1982. Scammell, makers of the heavy recovery vehicles that pulled broken tanks off battlefields, in 1988. Bedford, General Motors' British truck arm, closed in 1986. Commer had gone quietly in the early 90s. Seddon Atkinson lingered under various owners until 2004. The brand finally retired by Iveco in 2009. From the early 70s to 2007, Britain lost every single heavy truck manufacturer it had ever produced. Not one survived as an independent builder. Not one. A country that had invented the commercial motor vehicle, that had built the lorries that supplied the Western Front and the convoys that fed Berlin during the airlift, that had exported trucks to every corner of the Commonwealth. That country now imported every heavy lorry that moved on its roads. The causes were structural, and they were relentless. Common market entry in 1973 opened the UK to Volvo, Scania, DAF, Mercedes, MAN, and Iveco, all backed by domestic markets large enough to amortize cab and engine costs that Britain's fragmented industry couldn't match. British Leyland's 1968 nationalisation absorbed AEC, Albion, Scammell and Guy into a sprawling conglomerate that produced strikes more reliably than trucks. Drivers preferred continental tilt cabs with proper sleepers, cabs designed for men who lived on the road, not cabs designed by engineers who went home every evening to a semi in Luton. Emissions regulations from Euro 1 onwards demanded R&D investment that only continental scale could fund. And the strong pound of the early 80s and late 90s priced British exports out of traditional Commonwealth markets, closing the overseas routes that had given firms like ERF breathing room when the domestic market contracted. Today, DAF, built at the Leyland plant near Preston by PACCAR, holds 32% of the UK heavy truck market. Scania and Volvo split most of the rest. The only volume heavy truck assembled in Britain is a Dutch-designed vehicle owned by an American corporation. The UK moved nearly 1.5 billion tonnes of goods by heavy goods vehicle in 2019 and is a price taker on every cab, engine, telematics platform and electric truck specification. The symbolic closing chapter came in 2005 when the Ministry of Defence awarded its £1.3 billion support vehicle programme to MAN ERF UK, using German trucks badged ERF. Even the British Army's lorries were someone else's. What remains in Sandbach? The Sunworks has been progressively redeveloped. The Middlewich factory at ERF Way, Midpoint 18, is a Wincanton distribution centre now, a building that once assembled hand-built lorries, picks and ships pallets for retailers. Walk past it, and there's nothing to tell you what happened here. No sound of pneumatic guns, no smell of cutting oil, just the hum of refrigerated trailers and the beep of reversing forklifts. The road still bears the name ERF Way. It is the only public acknowledgement that this was once a place where things were made, not merely moved. Foden's old 30-acre site was redeveloped from 2011 into 248 houses, light industrial units, and the Edwin Foden Business Centre, a multi-tenant office building named for a man whose works once occupied the ground beneath it. The Foden family mansion at Westfields was demolished in 2008 to make way for Cheshire East Council headquarters, itself closed in December 2024. A family house became a council building, became an empty building. Sandbach's relationship with its industrial past runs through layers of demolition and repurposing, each one removing the physical evidence a little further from view, until the only reminder is a name on a road sign and a space in the landscape where something used to be. There is no statue, no permanent museum exhibit at either site, no plaque at either factory entrance. The men who built 4,000 lorries a year in a town of 5,000 souls left no mark on the public landscape of the place they made. Chapter 10. Chassis number 63. The principal heritage markers are private. ERF number 1, the 1933 prototype with chassis number 63, sits in the British Commercial Vehicle Museum at Leyland, a truck built in a greenhouse, preserved in a museum 100 miles from the town where it was assembled. The last Foden, an 8x4 tipper from August 2006, donated by Packer, stands in the same building. The Preservation Society ERF, Historic Vehicles Limited, REVS, founded in 1988, has around 650 members who keep the surviving trucks running, maintain the archives, and carry the memory of what 1,400 workers once produced. The Foden Society does the same for the other marque, and every year the Sandbach Transport Festival draws around 10,000 spectators to a free Sunday parade of preserved Foden and ERF vehicles, accompanied by Foden's brass band. The band predates both truck factories. It will outlast the memory of both. But on that one Sunday a year, the lorries drive through the town again, and the sound of diesel engines fills the streets of a place that used to hear them every working day. Gardner engines and Cummins engines and the particular exhaust note of a heavy lorry at low revs, the sound that for 70 years was the background hum of Sandbach life. 10,000 people come to watch the lorries drive through a town that doesn't build them anymore. What do they come for? Not nostalgia exactly, something quieter than that. A recognition perhaps of something that was real, that was made here, by hand, by men who knew what they were doing, and sent out onto the roads to do work that mattered. The symmetry of this story is almost too precise to be real. In 1933, a 63-year-old engineer, fired by his stepmother, started a truck company in a greenhouse with a chassis numbered to match his age. 68 years later, a 25-year-old qualified accountant named Stephanie Frobisher, 6 weeks into her job at the same company in the same town, wrote a memo that brought the whole edifice down. Between those two moments, the greenhouse and the memo, sat 7 decades of hand-built lorries, a peak year of 3,740 trucks, the EC Olympic with its microwave and velour seats, Peter Foden's morning walk, Dave Roberts' 26 years at the service centre, the 8 Lowfield drivers grinning beside their ERFs in August 1989. The fraud didn't kill ERF on its own. By 2001, the company was loss-making and dependent on a single Cummins engine as its only differentiator from the German parent. The Continental tide would have reached Sandbach eventually. It reached every other British truck maker, without exception, over the preceding 40 years. But the fraud transformed man's posture from patient stewardship to something much harder and colder, and it accelerated the closure by perhaps a decade. Without the fraud, ERF might have lingered as a niche Cummins-engined sub-brand into the 2010s. A quiet retirement rather than a sudden death. With it, the badge was finished by 2007. And Britain, a country that moves 1.5 billion tonnes of goods a year by road, no longer built its own heavy lorries. What Annie Cowup Foden started in that boardroom in 1932, and what Stephen Ellis finished in that finance office 65 years later, was in the end the same act. Someone who controlled the books decided that the books would serve their interests, not the truth. Between those two acts of financial control, one a family power play, the other a criminal fraud, sat everything Sandbach built and everything Sandbach lost. The greenhouse, the chassis numbered 63, the clear view cab and the Sabrina nickname, the 4,000 trucks a year, the kit truck philosophy that kept an independent company alive longer than anyone had a right to expect. The EC Olympic on the A1 at 2 in the morning, a driver eating a hot meal in a cab designed by people who understood his life. The lorries still pass through Sandbach. They carry the goods. They bear the names of German and Swedish and Dutch manufacturers. And the town where they were made, 2 factories, 1 family, one extraordinary industry, is a name on a motorway service station now, a place the trucks drive past. No longer a place where they're built,